Okay, hello everyone, and good afternoon or good morning. And I want to say thank you for joining us today for this next installment of the Society of American Archivists Records Management Section virtual hangout series. We're glad you could join us today or watch when it's convenient for you. So today we are joined by Jackie Esposito from Penn State University, and she's going to talk about the survey that she did on the institutional placement of records management and archival services. So this is an important topic when talking about the success of programs, and looking forward to hearing more about it. So I am Beth Cron, and I am the immediate past chair of the records management section. And we're joined today by Era Tanzi, who is the chair, the current chair, and looks like Jessica Dermasic, who's a member of the steering committee as well. Jackie Esposito, as I said, is from Penn State University. She has more than 25 years of archival and records management experience. She's been serving as both faculty and administrator for the Penn State University Archive since 2001. She joined the faculty of the university libraries in July of 1991 as an assistant university archivist for records management and a senior assistant librarian. And she was tenured and promoted to full librarian in 2014. So she has worked on numerous articles and co-authored Penn State's ELECTRAR, Electronic Records Repository Specifications Report, and she's presented at several conference papers on team management of born digital records and served on SAA's Digital Archives Continuing Education Task Force. So we are excited to have her here with us today, where she's going to talk about her most recent work, and that was a survey on the institutional placement of records management and archival services. So how this is going to go today is Jackie's going to give us a presentation, and I'll be sharing the slides, and then we should have plenty of time for your questions. So you can ask questions on Twitter using the SAA RMS hashtag, and that was shared in the scheduled blog post. And we'll also be monitoring comments on the YouTube live streaming page. To note, those can be a little bit delayed, but I'll be watching to see as questions come up. So now I am going to turn it over to Jackie.
Good afternoon, everybody. When I started working on this survey, what I was attempting to do was to find out exactly what worked in successful institutions. There had been a series of changes in a number of colleges and universities where the archival program and or the records management program had been in the library or been in administration and had been moved. There was one university that had moved its records management program 4 times in 6 years. And so I thought what I would do is to send out a survey to find out what people were doing and what was succeeding, as well as to follow up with some site visits. So what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes is exactly how the survey ran and the results of the survey. The survey is available online and it is open access. You can use all of the materials, and we will make this PowerPoint available to anyone who would like to see the PowerPoint. So the first thing that I did was to kind of structure the research in terms of archives being active motivators, active participants in creating the history of their institution and in working with their institution. Many times records management programs work with archival programs in terms of collection, management, and development. What's out there, who's collecting things, who have problems. So one of the first issues and one of the first things we'll talk about is the struggle to fit. The struggle to fit is exactly asking the question, where should the records management program be? In a variety of colleges and universities, it's in numerous places. It's either part of the finance and business office. Parts of it may answer to the Office of General Counsel. It may be part of the public records office, depending on state laws, or it may be part of the library and archives. And while it doesn't necessarily matter exactly what office it fits in, it does matter when it comes to compliance. Because one of the questions that you often get as you're trying to implement records management is, why do I have to? What are the consequences if I don't follow these rules and procedures? And if you're headquartered in a library or an archives, how can you, quote unquote, force people to comply? And how can you force them to be compliant if you don't have anything other than a carrot? I always found in the 20 plus years that I worked on this, that using the carrot and trying to convince people that this was the best way to operate, that having control over their records, knowing what they have, getting rid of records in a reasonable period of time, and transferring historical records to the archives actually was in their best interest. That carrot really works well when there are no crises and no risk involved. But once you have a crisis or once you have a records issue, then you have to be able to enforce compliance. And that's very, very hard to do if you're not in an office that has some way of doing that. So I looked at the challenges of poor institutional placement. What are the things that really cause institutions to struggle? And one of the biggest ones is failure to thrive. Records management programs just don't continue to exist. They're there for a while, they work for a while, and then they just get ignored. And then they're only paid attention to when there's a crisis. Because people are risk averse, because they think it has a lot to do with extra work and extra responsibilities, they don't want to be involved in it. So there's a slow responsiveness, and that's particularly critical when it comes to a crisis or a breach. The way that the federal records laws work right now, if you receive a subpoena under certain characteristics and for certain pieces of information, the subpoena may need to be answered in as little as 30 days. Slow responsiveness in a crisis or breach really can't happen. So you have to create a cohesive environment in terms of responding to retention schedules and responding to requests for information. That means you have to know where it is. If it's a small institution, you may be able to do that. But if you're in a large institution, that becomes increasingly impossible when the institution has hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who are responsible for the records you're looking for. It's particularly an issue when it comes to email. Who has the original email, who's in charge of the email, and who can be responsible for submitting the record copy. There's also a problem with lack of enforcement of retention schedules and issues with communications. Part of that involves all of the services, what I have referred to as a litany of services that records management and archival offices wind up being responsible for. Archives clearly are responsible for the stewardship of permanent records, but since the year 2000 or so, they've also been responsible for the capture and storage of electronic records. That does include email. It includes data management and security, and more often than not, that includes big data and scientific data and health data. Includes disposition and destruction of records, especially records that don't have long-term retention periods. Sometimes it includes facilities management for storage annexes. It almost always includes FERPA, HIPAA, FOIA, and Public Records Act compliance, litigation hold compliance, policy development management, on and on and on. The litany of services that was included in the survey included over 30 different areas where the Archives and Records Management Program were responsible for records issues for the institution. So I wanted to look at the current status. What was the current status of Penn State's stakeholders and benchmarking partners? So that included the Big 10 institutional archives and records management programs. That's actually 15 institutions, including the University of Chicago. That part of the research became a qualitative survey, in that I went to every one of the institutions, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I also wanted to look at the role of university archives in the oversight of permanent records. Permanent records meaning records that have very long-term retention. Some might say forever retention. And who's in charge of that? Where are those records held? And when those records are electronic, how do we manage those records across multiple servers with multiple data stewards? Who are your best partners across the university offices? Clearly, the archivist and records manager cannot do all this work themselves. They're, one person, it's a huge job. Who are their partners? Who can they go to work with on these kinds of initiatives? And then what are those working relationships? And how do those working relationships fit within special collections, within distinctive collections, and across universities in general? And then the big elephant in the room for records right now is born digital content and email. So there were two stages to the research structure. The first was quantitative. That included a 70-question, open-ended questions using Qualtrics software. Many of the questions included comments, and the comments were very detailed. There's at least one question where the comments went on for 8 pages of notes. It was distributed between June 1st and July 30th of 2016. It was distributed over numerous listservs, including the Big Ten Archivist listserv, Archives and Archivist listserv, the Records Manager listservs, Government Archivist listservs, and pretty much anyone who asked me for permission to distribute it was given permission to distribute it. We wound up with 123 responses, which was really exciting for me, because the last time a comprehensive survey of records management and archives was done in 2008, they had about 58, 59 responses. So this doubled the amount of responses. And as I said, the survey is available on public access at Penn State under Scholarsphere. The sample questions were things like, does your institution have a records management program? What level of records management program? What is the staffing for the program? What kinds of services does the program have? And who delivers those services? It also has questions about administration. Who are the partners? How do they work with the administration? And what kinds of issues do you run into in terms of staffing? There were questions about staffing specific to, do you have a records manager? Do you have a records liaison program? Do you have a records advisory committee? All of those questions were asked and answered, and every one of the questions had a comment section. The qualitative part of the research involved site visits. So between July and October of 2016, I was given the opportunity through a research grant, the Nancy Eaton Research Grant, to travel to all of the Big Ten universities. So that includes Michigan, Michigan State, University of Chicago, University of Illinois, Northwestern, Indiana University, Purdue University, Ohio State, Rutgers, the University of Maryland, University of Iowa, Nebraska-Lincoln, Minnesota, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And to include Penn State, who's also a partner, I had a series of meetings and conversations with equivalent offices at Penn State, as I would have as if I were visiting the Penn State the way I visited the other universities and colleges. So the visits were structured on the opportunity to review both what was going on at those universities in terms of records management and their archives. Where were they situated? What was the institutional placement? How did the institutions work? And how did this mirror what was going on in higher education in general? I was afforded the opportunity to review legislation. That's particularly important in states where there are open records laws, where you have to, as the university, respond to open requests for records in a specific date and time structure. What were the structures of the records management and archival programs? What were the employment paradigms? How many people did each institution have working on these initiatives? Who were their internal partners and who were their external partners? What were the processes for public records? What were the structures for archival records? And in that case, with archival records, we also discussed donor restrictions and closure periods. What are the closure periods? And in some cases, I even looked at special collections at higher education institutions, because oftentimes records management programs were administered out of the special collections library. And so what kinds of special collections were being collected and what were the initiatives there? The visits afforded me the opportunity to review their operational models, but it also afforded them the opportunity to ask questions about Penn State's model, what Penn State was doing, and to answer questions about Penn State's compliance with litigation and with crisis management in terms of records management. And so there was a give and take atmosphere. It was an important time to do it because many of the Big Ten universities were looking at changing hiring, and several of them have hired records managers since the summer of 2016. Penn State actually hired their first official records manager July of 2016, and Ohio State and Indiana have done the same. Other institutions changed the position a bit, but it was a time when there was enough change in the Big Ten that it was worth having these discussions. The site visits included meetings and interviews with selected representatives of partner offices. Now, I will say right up front that I didn't get to meet with everybody at every institution. I allowed the institutions I was visiting to decide who I would meet with based on the criteria of wanting to know how they manage records, records retention, and university archives. So meetings often included the Office of General Counsel, Risk Management, the Chief Information Officer, the Public Records Officer, always included the records manager and university archivist, sometimes included student records and registrars, inactive record center management, local IT specialists, the vice presidents, vice provost for business and finance, all of those areas where this might indeed be part of the structure and these offices might be partners. I used a basic research tool, and that research tool was the Records Continuum Model. This model was developed in Australia by the Society of Australian Archivists to look at where evidence crosses with transactions, record keeping, and identity. Now, I chose this specifically because I was looking at both records management and archives, and it works particularly well when you're looking at records management because it looks at the creation, capture, organization, and then access of records. And those were the issues that were particularly important when you look at overlaps between archives and records management. The continuum model emphasizes partnerships and emphasizes time stages in the life cycle model. So if we look at the records management life cycle model, which essentially argues that all records have a specific life cycle, and that's what retention periods are based on, what the continuum model suggests is that these aren't necessarily always time-bound, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. There are some times where we look at overlaps and say, well, we keep this for a period of time. This is particularly interesting when we look at electronic records and especially email in terms of decisions about how long to keep things and whether to tie email to the subject matter as well as to the retention period for a record type. The continuum also allows for an integration between record keeping and archival processes. And so the approach looks at how you identify permanence for certain records and allows archives to be very specific about what the permanent historical record means and to identify which records fall into that category. I took the qualitative and the quantitative research and came up with patterns and recommendations. So the first recommendation for me is one of the most important recommendations. And it's a recognition that information and records represent an institutional asset. When we look at records management, we almost always talk about costs that are deferred, costs that we don't spend by paying attention to records issues, deferred costs, delayed costs. But there are many, many costs involved in providing access to institutional information, and there need to be appropriate resources assigned from central administrative funding. Records management and archives is not an individual department's mandate. It's an institutional mandate, and as such needs to and requires that resources be afforded to it. And if I found one thing in terms of the surveys and the visits that overlap, is that there was almost universally underrepresentation in resources. There was not enough money, there were not enough human beings, there was not enough server space, and this needed to be addressed. Because if you have a breach and if you have a compliance issue, your institution's going to have to find the resources, and they're going to have to take the resources from something. And so in my mind, the recommendation that I'm offering is that if we treated information and information management as an institutional asset, the same way as we do HR and facilities and development, then we would have sufficient resources to make sure that we are in compliance at all times and can respond to subpoenas and breaches in a timely and efficient manner. The second recommendation has to do with the partnership between records management and institutional archives. Records management and institutional archives, whether they work together in a single department or they're separate departments, have to actively collaborate. They cannot work in silos. They cannot work separately. They have to talk to one another. They have to partner to identify records, to manage those records that have been identified, to preserve for the long-term historical records, and then to provide access to institutional records. This is specifically important if we're talking about records in a public records environment, but any records that the public feels it has a desire for flexibility and access, they need to necessarily work together. They don't necessarily benefit by being administered jointly through one department. If you can make that happen, that's great. If you can't, there should be a mandated collaboration, regardless of institutional administrative placement. So if the records management office happens to be in the office of risk and compliance or in the office of general counsel and the archives is in the library, those two people should be meeting on a regular basis, once a week, once a month, no less than once a month, so that they know what's going on around the institution, so they know who has what records and what they're doing with them. This is particularly important when it comes to establishing policies and procedures. Records management policy requirements have to include mandatory enforcement. Offices can't be allowed to say it doesn't happen in my office, or it's not the law in my office, or I'm not complying. That can't happen. This is an institutional asset. Records are institutional information, and it has to require mandatory enforcement. It also means that there have to be clear and distinct retention schedules that are visited regularly to make sure that they are indeed accurate and up to date. It would really help to have a records management advisory committee. I have to say that at Penn State, we established a records management advisory committee back in the early 1990s, And when I was running both the archives and records management program, they were a lifeline because the advisory committee were representatives of all of the offices where records were created: finance, registrar, student records, faculty records, HR, facilities, and they were invaluable in helping to identify what the records rules were, what the records regulations were, and then to help trickle down compliance requirements. There also should be a records management liaison network. Every department, every college, every administrative office should have somebody who the records manager and/or the archivist can go to talk about records in that office. The records manager and the archivist doesn't need to be the person who knows what the English department is keeping or what the dairy science department is keeping, but there should be somebody in English and/or dairy science who the records manager and the archivist can talk to. That liaison network are the boots on the ground. Those are the people who day to day know what's being done in those offices. And then there has to be a standard amount of training. There has to be just-in-time training when you have requirements for financial records at the end of the fiscal year, or student records at the beginning of the academic year, or annual requirements for any kind of other records. You also have to have training for thematic topics, and the training gets repeated over and over and over because employees change, and the procedures may change, and the policies may change. So you do have to have regularized training. The third recommendation has to do with born digital and email records management issues, and it has to be addressed immediately. The archives should have access early in the creation process and stewardship over formats of university permanent records across creator offices. That means it's important to acknowledge that email is being produced, that will be permanent records, and we have to be able to find a way of saving those permanent records even if they are born digital. I'm not making any recommendations here about specific hardware or software to do that, but it has to happen, and it's no longer sufficient to say we'll get to it or we'll figure it out. We have to get to a point where we make recommendations about what works best for email and for born digital records. The fourth recommendation has to do with codification of compliance requirements. Who coordinates compliance? Who has to be responsible for these issues, whether it's risk management, privacy, internal audit, IT security, and how those offices work with records management programs, as well as with academic units such as the archives or the libraries. And having those partnerships and making sure that those partnerships are codified and mandated are really important. Having partnerships that are built on entirely networks and friendships are nice, and they work really well, but it's much better to have a very clear chain of command for when you need to respond and who needs to respond and who has the answers when a question comes up. All of that said, where are we today? It's been almost a year since I finished the research. So I will say that my Big 10 institutional partners are all working on hiring, updating their operations, updating their strategies, coming up with new policies and procedures. And we are able to share most of those through a very active listserv and helping one another identify what the issues are and what are the best ways of addressing those issues based on our own institutional culture and state and federal mandates. I've also looked at the role of the university archives in oversight of permanent records, and that includes a very clear and long-term look at what are permanent historical records and at what point in the creation of historical records should the archives become embedded. With electronic records, it's better to be embedded earlier, but in any type of record creation, working with the office that's creating it, working with the donor that's creating it is much better earlier on than later on in the process. And then developing the strategic partnerships. And that is super critical in that no one office can address records requirement issues. No one office can find all of the records when a subpoena has been issued. So developing those partnerships, making sure the partnerships are healthy and active and viable, and that the training is being offered are really important. The working relationship between records management and special collections has to be strong. And so one of the things that I'm doing here at Penn State is working with our current records manager on making sure that the archives and the records management program are coordinated and that the records issues that come up are discussed among various platforms. And that includes, you know, do we keep these records? Who keeps them? Do they stay at the office of origin? Who is the creator? Who's the data steward? And that also included the university developing a data steward model and a data compliance structure. It also includes looking at who's doing some good work in terms of email management. Ohio State and Dan Noonan have been looking at Outlook as a way of managing email. There are other practices that are going on at other institutions, and who has some of the best practices. It is not necessary to reinvent the wheel. It is necessary to know what works and what doesn't work. So being open and compliant about what you're doing and letting your colleagues know where you are is really helpful. So what I've done is looked at the research and applied the sustainable improvement metrics for performance. The sustainable improvement metrics is a continuous improvement scale that looks at where in leadership should direction be coming from, which employees are held accountable, how do we identify what the risk is, how do we control the risks, or at least mitigate the risk, understand what it is, how do we share knowledge, and in sharing knowledge, what do we do about training, as well as managing change. And then to understand that this is a continuous process, that it isn't just once and done, that we're going to continue to do this every year, every 6 months, every 3 or 4 months, that we have to keep working on the sustainable improvement of these metrics, because it's becoming more and more important to know what records we have to be able to get to those records and make them accessible on demand when they're being required. That all said, that all said, there's multiple opportunities to look at the data and take apart the data and say, here's what's important for an inactive records center. Here's what's important for a records management program. Here's what's important for an archival program, and then extend that to your institution. I would say that one of the things that's critically important, if you're the archivist, you're the records manager, and you're in charge of this, is for you to understand your institution's culture. What works at your institution may not work at another institution, and you need to understand where the points are that you can push some of these issues. I'm more than happy to provide data and provide information and answer questions, but you also need to take some time and understand what's going on at your institution, to understand what the state laws are in your state, and then to look at the numerous changes to federal laws that are impacting what we can do with things like student records and HIPAA records, as well as how we share that information across our own institutions. Because the biggest hindrance to making these programs successful is communicating with the people who actually have the records in their offices as to what they need to do with them. In my experience, the happiest I can make employees at Penn State when I was going to their offices was telling them they did not have to keep records and it was okay for them to get rid of them, and here was the reasons why. It wasn't that they necessarily wanted to be hoarders, it's that they wanted to have somebody tell them it was okay. And a lot of that saying it's okay comes out of knowing what the laws are and the retention schedules. On that note, I'd like to open it up to questions and answer whatever questions you have about either the qualitative research or the quantitative research that happened last year.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that served as a not only an overview of your research, but actually some really good lessons learned and best practices for running a records management program. So just a reminder that you can ask questions on YouTube, and I'll be monitoring that. And since there's just a little bit of a delay, we'll get to those. And then you can also ask questions on Twitter using hashtag SAARMS. So in the meantime, I guess I have a couple questions, and Era and Jessica, feel free to jump in if you have any too. So you mentioned in your report that many of the people you interviewed who were representing the various offices were meeting for the first time. And so I was wondering what it was like to hear those interactions, and do you know of any partnerships that came from people meeting for the first time to talk about their records issues?
What's always interesting when you're an outsider going to another institution is you can say the same things that the employees have been saying for the last 6 months, 6 years, but hearing it from an outsider, it sounds different. And so I had a number of those experiences. There was one Big Ten institution where the archival employees had not been able to get an appointment with or meet with the CIO, the Chief Information Officer. I was going to be on campus. He agreed to a meeting. We all went together, and they were able to ask as many, if not more, questions than I was about what was going to happen locally at that university, as well as my questions about how it fit in terms of IT management in general. I was interested in, who controls servers, who controls hardware and software for managing digital. They were concerned with what specifically was going to happen at their university. And so there was a dialogue on both avenues where I could get the information to my questions, and they could get information from someone that they had not had an opportunity to meet with. By opening that door, they then were able to set up regular monthly meetings, which was great because then they have that way into their own institutional hierarchy.
Very good. So I do have one here on YouTube. So in a situation where both records management and archives are under the same administrative roof, did you find it mattered who is in charge? Either the archivist reporting to the records manager or the other way around?
The survey results indicated that the vast majority of times the records manager answered to the archivist, and the archivist answered to either an administrator, like the senior vice president for finance, or the head of special collections, or a dean. So when the archivist has an administrative reporting line up through the administration, the records manager answered to the archivist. And that hierarchical structure was less important than the fact that they worked together, that they worked as partners in terms of who did what and who went out to talk to one another. Where it was more problematic was where one was in one office and one is in the other office. So if the records manager, it works under the senior vice president for finance, and the archivist is under the dean of libraries, getting them to talk together, getting them to partner on a regular basis is a challenge. Now, that said, the records manager in that case had a lot more resources. The records manager had a lot more staff, had a facility, had access to financial resources because of who they answer to. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both, but in the survey responses I got, almost all of them, as a matter of fact, I would say almost 9 out of 10 of them, the records manager reported to the archivist when that was the hierarchical structure.
Mm-hmm. So in the report, you also mentioned the need to move records management offices and university archives out of the libraries into a more compliance role. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about how that would work?
Right now, if the archives is either part of special collections or it answers directly to the library's dean, it has a hard time being perceived on campus as a compliance operation. Because aside from assigning fees for lost library books, the faculty and staff don't necessarily see the libraries as a compliance operation. That's not to say that you can't get faculty and staff to a point where they understand that this job in particular is about compliance, but they understand that risk management is about compliance. They understand that the privacy office is about compliance. And so oftentimes placement, institutional placement, if you're talking about compliance, is better when people understand why you're asking them to do things. I used to joke when I was records manager that I couldn't force anybody to do anything. I didn't even have a German Shepherd. I have a Basset Hound. I can't get the Basset Hound to force you to do anything. But if I'm in a compliance office and I tell you federal law says you're more likely to pay attention and follow the rules, that has a lot to do with human nature and has a lot to do with perceptions of who's asking you to be compliant and how. If it comes to a subpoena, it's going to come from the Office of General Counsel anyway, so it gets out of your hands. But on that first level, when you're telling somebody you have to follow these retention schedules because state and federal law says so, having somebody who has behind them the force of the president or the force of the compliance office helps in terms of perception.
With perception, hi, it's Jessica. With perception as well, does having a policy, I've dealt with what you just talked about, I'm based in the libraries, but does perception also change when you have a policy behind you, even if you're in the libraries, and it changes the cultural idea of what compliance is within the institution? Have you found that?
Well, you absolutely have to have a really strong policy behind you. I can't imagine a records management program operating without a strong policy and without strong support. And that was one of the reasons that I recommended a Records Management Advisory Council, because the Records Management Advisory Council is an intermediary between the policy and the person who has to enforce the policy, because they're the people who are in charge of those records. So if I'm going to an office that has a lot of student records and I can say to them, yes, we have a policy, yes, we have retention schedules, and we have this committee, this council that supports all of these programs and it includes the registrar, you're more likely to get compliance than you are if you just say, I'm here doing this because, you know, this is what I'm supposed to be doing and you're supposed to follow these retention schedules. So you absolutely need to have a strong policy. And you have to make sure your policy is current and it's reviewed regularly, the same way as you do with retention schedules. But it definitely helps to have the support of those people whose records you're managing and maintaining.
Right, absolutely. So I have another one from YouTube. Were you interested in determining in some way whether or not any specific organizational placements could affect records management operations or predict success for the records management program?
I was, having been in charge of a program for 25 plus years, I was interested in finding out if it worked better on the compliance administrative side of the academic house, or if it worked as well on the academic side of the house, having been on the academic side of the house for the entire time that I ran the program. There are advantages to working out of compliance. The big one has to do with resources. If you're reporting to somebody who's in charge of budgeting and finance and you need staff, or you need an inactive records center, or you need resources, it's easier to ask for and get those resources. On the other hand, if you're tied with the university archives and you have historical records, you are going to be getting a larger quantity of historical records because you're identifying who has the records, who the record stewards are, and you're going to work through with them. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both. It has, in my mind, the successful program has to do with what works best in your culture. If your culture responds better to a business model, then you're better off having the records management program as part of the business side of the house. If your culture deals better with the academic side of the house, you're a small liberal arts college, everyone understands the operation, everyone knows one another, you could very easily work out of the academic side of the house. But that's really part of what works best for your institution. One of the interesting parts of the survey is I had about a dozen offices from the state of Arizona fill out this survey, and then they were going to use it to decide state government records. And it was part of their looking at what part of the state institution they should be answering to, because right now they answer to one part of the state and thought it would be more important if they got enough data to move to a different part of state government. So it's not just higher education where you need to know who the players are and what is the best placement for that particular role, but it also happens in state government as well.
Well, that's good to know. That was one of my questions, is have you heard from organizations for applications of your research outside of colleges and universities, like government and corporate records managers? So that's good to know about the state of Arizona.
I had the opportunity in July of last year to do a presentation with Big Ten colleagues at NAGARA, the National Association for Government Archivists and Records Administrators. And immediately after that, I was asked to distribute the survey among NAGARA members. So it expanded the list of people who got the survey. And so I did hear from a fair number of government repositories who were looking at the same issue. Oftentimes in government archives, the records management program, the archivist answers to the Department of State or the Department of Education. And depending on who they answer to, how successful they've been in terms of getting compliance within their state. Now, I will say that state government agencies tend to be challenged as much as, if not more than, budgetary mandates as much as anything else. In states where they've been having problems with the budget and who takes care of the records because of the budgetary issues and how fast they can respond to records requests because of budgetary issues, that pushes their desire to want to be part of a department where they can have access to funds.
Right, that makes sense. So I have another one from YouTube. How successful were attempts to obtain additional funding or resources for records management or information governance?
Well, at Penn State, we were able to get a full-time records manager. Nathan started in July of 2016. A number of other Big Ten institutions were able to get money to have records managers, partly because of the move for public records access, and partly because it was clear that this was a necessary position to have. I think the bigger issue right now is how individual institutions are looking at their own email and what they're doing about that. So, for example, one of the things Penn State is looking at is 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we had as many as 83 different email systems. As of July of next year, we will have a single supported email system so that records on the back end can be managed for retention, among other reasons. But that's a big move, is to change the culture of an institution from everybody having their own email system and being able to do what they want to do, to having a centralized system that's managed. And so I think that's where you're going to see a lot of changes, is how people look at managing records and data classification based on what kinds of systems they're operating for things like business records and student records and their health records.
So what kind of additional questions do you have after doing this research? What are further areas of research that you see?
Well, the two areas that I'm continuing following up on is creation and management of permanent historical records and memory. One of the things I'm looking at right now, specifically because of an early retirement program at Penn State, is how we capture memory and how we capture institutional records, whether we do that with oral history interviews, whether we do that with identifying records of people at the point of time when they are going to be retiring, or prior to that point in time by identifying very specific offices. We routinely, institutional archives routinely understand that we have to get the president and the board of trustees and all those high-level offices, but we don't often look at lower-level offices like, what about all the student records and student organizations? What about the research centers and the activities of the research centers, and how do we capture those records before they disappear or before there's an early retirement and you know, hundreds of people leave and all their institutional memory goes with them. So I'm actually trying to look at how the records continuum works in terms of institutional memory creation, and how that ties into transfer and development of permanent records. The other thing that I have been looking at, in addition to that aspect of it, is what kinds of structures and recommendations that I can make for the two pieces that I think of the puzzle that work really well, that being the Records Management Advisory Committee and the Liaison Network. I think if you can set up both of those in your institution, it does two things. One, you're not alone. You're doing this with groups of people and you have support. And you also get the boots on the ground to understand why you're doing what you're doing, because you're with them and they're talking to you and you're doing their training and they're understanding why. And it creates an internal network on campus that you have that works with you. And that's really powerful. And so those two tools are something that I'm working on descriptors for in journal articles that I'm writing right now.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing more about that. So I take it, Era, you haven't had any questions yet. Okay. So I have another one here. Did any of the public universities have university level regulations regarding records management compliance or requirements? And if so, did that influence the placement and success of the records management program?
Many of the public universities have both state mandated regulations and policies as well as local regulations and policies. So if you're in a state, and I'll pick on Ohio because they have a state public law about records management. They have also had an organization where the universities have gotten together and tried to coordinate what their retention schedules are. And that, again, is really good, because then you have a network of people you're working with and you're not recreating the wheel, because all of the universities are going to have similar records. You know, all universities are going to have student records. All universities are going to have curriculum records, and how Ohio State is doing it maybe a little bit different than, say, Oberlin, but at least we have some, consistency in how we do things. So in states where there are state public records laws, many of the universities did have their own policies. Now, how often they look at the policies and revise the policies and what the policies mean were very inconsistent, and that was one of the, if you look in the comment sections of the survey, one of the comment sections where we're working on it, we're revising our policy, we expect to have a new policy approved. In states where the retention schedules have to be approved by the state legislature, that's usually a time drag. There are states where they put a retention period forward to the state legislature, and it can take anywhere from 3 to 18 to 24 months to get approved. In 24 months, that retention period could change. And so those kinds of time drags on how you can get things accomplished are really difficult. The other big difficult thing was the change in the nature of public records requests. So 10 years ago, the vast majority of public records requests were usually about facilities and budgeting. Who was this institution in Minnesota or Nebraska or Iowa hiring to build facilities? How open was that process? Were there minority contractors involved? In 2015, 16, 17, the tide changed, and the number of requests increased about things like student behavior and student discipline and activities on campus. And those were questions that normally weren't asked before and become problematic because they not only are FERPA-related questions, but they're also privacy-related questions when you're dealing with the student's personal record. And so the challenge is to be responsive to public records requests and protect people's privacies were clashing big time in terms of how public records officers could address what was being asked of them by newspapers and reporters and citizens.
All right. So are there any other questions, Sarah? No.
I'll ask a quick question.
Okay.
So mine is about this idea of enforcement and compliance. And I guess what I'm wondering is, one of the things I sometimes see is that sometimes that's something internal audit and compliance at a university will ask about, just, are you following the retention schedule? But I guess if money and time were no object and we could actually realize this, what do you think would be an effective way to do this? And can you point to any examples of universities that are doing a good job of, sorry about the phone in my background, any universities that are doing a good job of monitoring and enforcing compliance?
Well, one of the changes we did make at Penn State once the policy was approved was to have the internal audit office ask those questions. Do you know about the policy? In our case, it's AD 35. And are you following the policy? And are you following the retention schedules? Over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been trying to come up with a survey that could go down to the records creator level to ask them about their compliance, and that's still in the development stages. Where it works really well is where individual employees understand who they can ask questions of. It's that link between, I have these records, I know I'm supposed to do something with them, who do I call and who do I ask? And so that network becomes really critical. And so institutions where the network works really well. For example, at Rutgers, the inactive record center and the manager, the record center manager, works very well with offices for inactive records. He then is supposed to link with the university archivist. And when those links all work, that works really well. It's when one of those links breaks down and either the individual staff people don't know who to talk to or ask, or the records manager doesn't talk to the archivist or work directly with the archivist, that you have problems with where do records go and who takes care of them. But if you have a good workflow where the office person understands, this is who I call and this is what I ask them, and then that person knows to call the archivist if the records are, historical records, then it works perfectly and it's great. So in my mind, my blue sky was always to have all of the individual office people understand and know who to call, and to have the phone number right on their desk. We used to have a promotion where we handed out a little stress bear with the phone number so people would have it right on their desk so that they knew who to call, because that's where the link breaks. Is if I have a bunch of records and it's the end of the semester and I'm clearing out space, what do I do with them? And if I don't have an answer at that point, that's where it breaks.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your questions, and we are approaching the end of our hour, so we will conclude there. So thank you for asking the questions, and thank you so much, Jackie, for joining us today and explaining the results of your research. I know for myself this was very informative, and we'll point people to the full paper. We have that on the records on the schedule blog, and you can read that in its entirety. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having this session.
All right, thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.